Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Kate McKinney, and I'm an assistant professor of communication here at Simon Fraser University. So we're here tonight for an exciting double book launch for Gary Kinsman's The Regulation of Desire, the new third edition, and the second expanded edition of A.J. Withers' Disability, Politics, and Theory, along with A.J.'s new short film, The Unicorn Eradication Project, a story about eugenics, which A.J. will be screening for us this evening. Before I jump into things, a couple of access notes. So first off, in addition to ASL interpreters, we also have live captioning, and there's a link for that. If you'd like access to the live captions, there's a bunch of printouts with that link just by the front door. You can grab one there. There's also washrooms on this floor towards the elevators, and there are gender-neutral washrooms one floor up on the third floor, and both of those sets of washrooms are wheelchair accessible. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Simon Fraser University's downtown campus is located on the stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. And as we reflect this evening on this land and the relations between settler colonial universities and local host nations, I want to note that part of the work that we're here to do this evening is to think with Gary and A.J. about interlocking systems of oppression, including the ways that settler colonialism interacts with white-defined queerness, compulsory able-bodiedness, poverty, policing, and eugenics. So both of these books take up how radical thought can help us to both trace these connections, but also imagine other futures that are grounded in collective liberation. And these connective conversations and models for politics have always been critical and are particularly so at this moment as we witness Israel's genocide of Palestinian people. So we gather together tonight while students from UBC, SFU, Langara, Capilano, Thompson Rivers, Emily Carr, and I'm sure there are other students from other universities who I don't know about who are also at the encampment, have been in camp for almost 2 weeks on UBC's campus, demanding that our universities divest from Israel. Our students take on this work in the face of aggressive campaigns by universities to silence their speech and action through liberal practices of risk assessment and campus safety that actually mean, in practice, heavy and violent policing of our spaces of learning. So these are the kind of intersecting examples of gender, sexuality, disability, carcerality, and settler colonialism that books like The Regulation of Desire and Disability, Politics, and Theory can help us to better understand. And I'm particularly excited to think about these books together and hear these two scholar activists talk about the connections between their works this evening. So before I turn things over to Gary and AJ, a couple of thank yous. So first, we'd like to thank the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at SFU for supporting this event, and also in particular Casey McCarthy in that department for a tremendous amount of administrative support. We'd also like to thank our partners, the Van City Office of Community Engagement, and all the folks at that office who helped, whose work helped us support this event. There are books for sale at the back of the room. They're discounted, and also 25% of the book proceeds raised this evening are going to go to support Palestinian solidarity organizing. So the order of the evening is first Gary will talk for about 25 minutes, and then AJ will screen their film and then also talk for about 25 minutes, and that'll be followed by a Q&A. And I'm going to introduce Gary now before he speaks, and then I'll introduce AJ later on before AJ speaks. So Gary Kinsman is a queer liberation, anti-oppression, and anti-capitalist activist, and is the author of The Regulation of Desire, Queer Histories, Queer Struggles, and also the co-author of The Canadian War on Queers, National Security as Sexual Regulation, and co-editor of We Still Demand, Redefining Resistance in Sex and Gender Struggles. He's Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Laurentian University and an activist in the No Pride in Policing Coalition, the AIDS Activist History Project, and Queers for Palestine. So I haven't yet read the new edition of The Regulation of Desire. I just got my copy tonight from Laura in the back. But past editions of this book have been important part of my own learning as a scholar and activist all the way back to my undergraduate degree in critical studies in sexuality at UBC. The first edition of this book, I was reminded in prepping for tonight, was published in 1987, right? So against the backdrop of queer AIDS activism and anti-censorship activism, amongst other causes. And this is the second time Gary has updated this book to sort of reflect the relationship between queerness and emerging political formations. Gary's work in this book, and more generally, I think it models what queerness can offer to radical thought, but also how liberalism has co-opted and sanitized many understandings of what queerness is. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Gary to tell us more about the latest edition of his book.
Thanks, Kate. Great to see all of you here on a Friday night. It is Friday night, right? Okay. Could be wrong. So what I want to do is sort of lead you through a sort of exploration, including images and PowerPoint slides that sort of evokes what the third edition of the Regulation of Desire is all about. I have to say that when AJ approached me, my first thought was, couldn't we title it of second and third editions? Because I actually sort of think in some ways that's how I sort of think about some of what we're doing tonight. Now, let's see if this works the way I want it to. It does. So my talk is dedicated to the people of Palestine, who are certainly right now undergoing major genocidal attack. I can't really run up there to show you the images very much. Will people still hear me? Anyway, I'll try and be louder. But just to point this out, if you wanted to use this diagram right now, what's going on is the attempted annihilation of Gaza, and especially now the attack on Rafah. So, I mean, basically it's the attempt to eliminate a whole area of Palestinian territory and land. This is a photo of a demonstration, a joint demonstration by Jews Against Genocide and the Palestine Youth Movement from last fall at Union Station in Toronto. It was an attempt to obstruct and disrupt Union Station, which is a major train station in the city of Toronto. But I think it's an interesting image because of the way in which it brought together anti-Zionist Jews and the Palestine Youth Movement. I'm also dedicating the talk to my good friend Amy Gottlieb, who died last year of lymphoma, who was a major lesbian feminist, anti-racist, and anti-Zionist Jewish activist. We also left the Leninist left together, and our resignation letter from the Revolutionary Workers' League was called "We May Not Be Witches, but We Sure Have Been Burned." The other person I'm dedicating the talk to is Dorothy Smith, who was my thesis supervisor, who I always identified with Vancouver because she sort of lived here for a while and also unfortunately died here. So those people are also really important in terms of dedicating this talk. So it's really important for us to understand where we are. And I just came from the encampment at the University of British Columbia, where we heard from Slado, who is a major spokesperson for the women who are involved in the Wet'suwet'en struggle. And it was actually a really interesting presentation because she talked about strategy and tactics for our movements in general and for the encampment movement and Palestine solidarity movements in particular. And that's really quite important to remember. And what she talked about was that obviously we are all on Indigenous land. We can't simply accept Canada. It was quite clear listening to Slado that Canada is not the reference point for them. They are not Canadian. And to talk about Indigenous people as if they're somehow just a subset of Canada is to actually make invisible the history and continuing colonization of the Indigenous peoples. The colonization of the Indigenous peoples, I think, is really important for us to recognize. And I try to do this in the third edition in very different ways than I did previously to that, to understand that where modern sexuality and modern gender, in terms of the gender binary, come from, is actually the Western colonial response to the incredible gender and sexual diversity among Indigenous people on Turtle Island and entirely around the world as well. So that what becomes reproductive and heterosexuality as the norm being imposed on people is developed in response to what they interpreted as the barbarism of third and fourth gender groupings among Indigenous people. And that obviously has sexual as well as gender connotations as well. And clearly, Two-Spirit people are now reclaiming these traditions. One thing I wanted to just point out in terms of Two-Spirit people, because I experienced this over and over again, is that Two-Spirit people, in terms of mainstream LGBT plus organizing, are constructed as if they're simply a cultural minority. They're separated from the history of settler colonialism and genocidal practices. And it's important for us to understand that Two-Spirit people exist centrally in terms of those campaigns for settler colonialism and being attacked by it, and also forms of resistance to settler colonialism and genocidal practices. I think I'm going to try and stay here and work through this. So part of where I start always from, and I learned this from Dorothy Smith, is that you start with disjunctures, things that don't fit. And for me, thinking about the third edition of the Regulation of Desire, a big question was, how is it that the movement that I joined in 1972, that was a radical movement in the sense of getting to the root of the problem, how is it that that movement that was resisting the right wing, resisting police repression, was involved in direct action, AIDS activism, disability justice, how did it become a movement whose end game was same-sex marriage and middle-class white respectability? How did that transformation take place? And that's really what I'm trying to address in the third edition. Where did the neoliberal queer, as I call it, come from? How did it provide the social and historical basis for what Lisa Dugan popularizes as homonormativity, or how our movements become movements for sort of white middle class respectability along the lines of heterosexuality, or homonationalism, as Jasper Puar and other people have pointed out? How is it that the Western nation state becomes supposedly the vehicle for, quote, civilization, and people of color in the global south become vehicles for barbarism and homophobia? We need to challenge, of course, that entire framework. So in the third edition, I'm drawing upon a certain critical analysis of what neoliberalism is, and I guess I'll just focus on one dimension here. Many people on the left and sort of more liberal approaches characterize neoliberalism as simply a perspective about the shrinking of the state. And that really misunderstands what neoliberalism is all about. First of all, we have to understand that neoliberalism was a strategic capitalist and state response to our struggles in the 1960s and 1970s, including the emergence of gay liberation, lesbian feminism, black power, red power, global working class and national liberation insurgencies in the global south. Neoliberalism realized that capitalist relations and oppression relations were being put in question by this global circulation of struggles. Their response was to develop a proposal that was taken up by various different state and capitalist agencies, that we should cut back on the social wage and social programs. We should really push working class and poor people back and oppressed people more generally. But it wasn't simply about shrinking state relations and social programs. It was also about expanding massively the disciplinary and carceral aspects of state relations in terms of police, prisons, tightening up of borders against racialized people from the global south, and a real focus on law and order. And that is something that informs all of the different currents within neoliberalism, including the more moral conservative and the more liberal dimensions. So the question I ask is, how did the accommodation of queers with neoliberal capitalist relations come about? And that's what I'm really exploring here. Within the context of liberal forms of neoliberalism, the white neoliberal queer accepts racial capitalist relations and wants simply to be included as a largely white middle-class queer layer into these relations. The neoliberal queer strives for integration into normality and wishes to make us forget the radical, as in getting to the roots of the problem, and transformative roots and histories of queer and trans struggles. So it's about the social organization of forgetting, of where we actually came from and the radical transformative roots of our struggles. Instead, I argue that the antidote has to be the remembering of embodied forms of resistance. Initially, our movement was actually defined by liberation politics. The Gay Liberation Front in New York City named itself after the National Liberation Front in South Vietnam that was currently engaged in armed struggle with US military and US imperialism. There were attempts to build alliances, not always successful, with the Black Panther Party. But that liberationist moment that was there at the very beginning becomes transformed over the years into a type of human rights strategy, which has a number of limitations. Initially, that human rights strategy is put forward as a tactic for building our movements. But in the context of the development of human rights law and state formation, and especially in the context of the Charter, this actually becomes something rather different. This slide is a picture from 1978 of the lead contingent of the contingent at the very front of the demonstration against Anita Bryant in 1978 in Toronto. Anita Bryant also came here. There were major demonstrations that were organized in Vancouver as well. The lead contingent was made up of the Lesbian Organization of Toronto, Wages Due Lesbians, and Women Against Violence Against Women. I'm pointing this out just to show the incredible involvement of lesbians and lesbian feminism in mobilizing against the right-wing form of neoliberalism. But we also saw fairly quickly organizing by Black and racialized queer people and Two-Spirit people. Some of the people you see up there are Makeda Silvera. This is very Toronto specific. Makeda Silvera, Richard Fung, Doug Stewart. And you also saw the emergence of Two-Spirit people organizing their own groups of people to deal with both the white racism they felt and experienced in our communities, as well as the types of forms of heterosexism that they sometimes experience within their own communities. Then, of course, we have the empire striking back in terms of a massive escalation of sexual policing. Just a diagram from the work of Tom Hooper, who I'd highly recommend looking at in terms of this moment of the escalation of sexual policing. And on that diagram, it's too small for you to actually see this, but you see what happened in Montreal in 1976 with the attempt to close down all gay and lesbian establishments in Montreal because of the Olympics. You also see the major mobilization around the Toronto bath raids. There's a lot more that goes on there. In Toronto in 1981, there are massive bath raids that are produced by, maybe I'll just step back for a moment. The neoliberal queer line is that in 1969, Pierre-Elliott Trudeau either legalized or entirely decriminalized homosexuality. This is complete and total nonsense. What was done was simply the very, very partial decriminalization of two offenses, gross indecency and buggery, if they were conducted in private, basically behind locked bedroom doors, if they involved only two people, and if they did not involve anyone under the age of 21. The 1969 Criminal Code mandated and directed the police to go after all types of sexual activities that were done in the so-called broader public realm or involved more than 2 people, or involved younger people at that point in time. Thanks. That means that the police, as our communities grew, as sex-related establishments expanded, the police were mandated by the law to actually go after these establishments. So in Toronto in 1981, in February, you see the largest mass arrests of close to 300 men since the declaration of the War Measures Act in 1970. Now since then, there's been much larger mass arrests, Clackwood Sound, the G20 in Toronto, and many other types of things like that have come close to what happened in the War Measures Act. The police used the body house legislation to round up men as found-ins in a common body house. What this meant was people were seen as engaging in acts of indecency, and therefore could be charged by the police. Didn't matter what they were actually doing at that particular moment in the establishment. If it was a place habitually resorted to for acts of indecency, they could be arrested. Obviously, the body house legislation was also directed against sex workers as well. And that is part of the historic link between police repression and other forms of oppression of queer people and sex workers. The Right to Privacy Committee is successful in getting most of those charged acquitted of their charges. I'll just relay one example. There was one gay Asian man who was charged as a found-in the 1981 bath raids. Gay Asians Toronto flooded the courtroom with its members, and the police were unable to actually identify the person who had been charged. Just to give you a sort of sense of the type of racism that exists in the Toronto Police Services at that point of time and continuing. Now, there's liberal, very narrow uses of the right to privacy, but there also were very transformative notions of it that were used by the Right to Privacy Committee trying to defend people. So George Smith and other people in the Right to Privacy Committee, and I was involved in it, said that what was important to look at were the social practices people engaged in. People could actually construct relations of intimacy and privacy in state-defined public places, and we needed to defend them. And the Right to Privacy Committee was actually pretty successful in that. There was major resistance to the bath raids, and maybe I'll just mention 2 things here. It's actually Chris Birchall who developed the slogan of "No More Shit," which we were also chanting in the streets of Toronto last year during abolitionist and anti-fascist pride when we were outside 52 Division, which was the major police station that was involved in the bath raids. The other image I will point out is the lead banner in the second major demonstration against the bath raids in February of 1981. This is after we got rid of the undercover cops who had sliced and diced the banner and taken out the bamboo pole. So you see they're actually having difficulty carrying part of the banner. And what we said to the police after that was, you tried to actually destroy our front banner. You tried to create a disruption that would prevent us from going onto Yonge Street. At that point, it was illegal to go onto Yonge Street, the main street in Toronto. And we just said, we're going onto that street. And we organized ourselves so we would, and we were able to do it. Now, what happens in a whole series of communities is that when there's actually mass mobilizations, major community mobilizations going on within our communities, there's a massive expansion of the organizations that exist, of ghettos, of commercialization of our communities. But when those mass forms of organizing start to die down, the people who rise to the top are largely white middle-class professional types. They come to speak for our communities. They come to develop a mirage of our communities as being raceless and classless in character, that the community supposedly has unitary interests, and there's no major struggles over that. And they actually begin to be recognized by state agencies as the legitimate representatives of our community. That's happened in numerous locations across the so-called Canadian state. What this means is there's a certain layer that I describe as the neoliberal queer that has engaged in a one-sided racialized class struggle within our communities to define our communities in their own interests. And it's about time that we actually joined from the other side. in terms of a racialized class struggle from our own vantage points, to try to resist and to push back the types of transformations that the neoliberal queer has made. Now, there are different forms of neoliberalism. I sort of hinted at that before. There's first moral conservative forms of neoliberalism, and then there's other forms of more liberal forms of neoliberalism. And I think at one point we actually thought that winning against moral conservatism meant we were winning against neoliberalism itself, which was not the case. There's a whole series of tendencies that lead towards the emergence of the neoliberal queer. There's the pink market, consumer forms of citizenship, which of course excludes lots of people who don't have the money to actually afford to be part of those pink markets. There's incredible forms of collaboration with the police. Go into a lot more detail on that, but it's important to point out the first dialogue committee with the police starts in 1975 here in Vancouver, when Search organizes a dialogue committee with the police, which basically develops ways of policing ourselves. The Gay Alliance Towards Equality and sex workers really challenged that notion of trying to develop liaison with the police. There's also development of residential and real estate class relations and gentrification. And in the Vancouver context, and I think this is probably familiar to people, white gay men, white middle-class gay men in the west end of the city actually waged a major campaign against sex workers, pushing them out of the area and creating real difficult working conditions for sex workers. And that's also been done in Toronto and also against unhoused people in both Vancouver, Toronto, and many other locations. I think I'll just jump ahead a little bit to a critical analysis of the same-sex marriage struggle, which I really would recommend people looking at the work of Suzanne Lennon and Omi Sheree Dryden, who actually talk about the race and class character of the same-sex marriage campaign, which I'm not going to be able to go into in any detail here, but I do talk about it in the third edition. Here I just point out that Alan Sears asked some really perceptive questions in the title of an article he wrote called, "Is There Still Sex After Marriage?" And also El Chenier in their work, and unfortunately Elle's not able to be here tonight, on the marriage struggles that actually took place in the early 1970s that had a really radical character. I won't go into any details on my particular submission here, except to say that when I made a submission to the Standing Committee on Same-Sex Marriage, it was entitled, "Don't Get Me to the Church on Time," in 2002. And that was actually a play on a line from a song from Oklahoma. And of course, there's also repression of queers against Israeli apartheid and the major resistance in response to that. And there's other paths that we could have followed in terms of the history of queer opposition to war and militarism. Just to give one example, when I first came out in 1972, do you want to know what was the most regular queer or lesbian or gay activity that was going on? It was gay contingents and lesbian contingents in anti-Vietnam War demonstrations. Now, do we ever remember those things? Those are really important for us to remember right now in terms of what's going on in Palestine. And of course, part of it is also the social organization of forgetting and the need for the resistance of remembering. I included that cover because it includes my friend Aziz Chaudhry, who edited that book, Activists in the Surveillance State, who unfortunately died a couple of years ago. And of course, there's the apology moment itself, which I won't really go into, but I'll just point out that I was in the room and I heard Justin Trudeau say 13 times that we are sorry. And after a certain point, it just became entirely meaningless. And also the notion of intersectionality that was used. And this comes in large part from EGAL, one of the most mainstream LGBT plus groups in the country, that when intersectionality gets reduced simply to diversity and inclusion. I won't mention his explanation of why this all took place, but basically he said it was simply the thinking of the day that caused this. And I've got a few more slides that I'm going to try and rush through, if that's okay. So I think if we're looking for hopeful alternatives, that we actually need to see that there's the people who were excluded from the rights revolution, lots of people in our communities who are actually resisting and rising up. That includes groups like Black Lives Matter, the opposition to corporatization, support for Indigenous struggles, and solidarity with Palestinian people. That image, if you haven't seen it, is one of the images from 2016 in Toronto when Black Lives Matter Toronto stopped the Pride Parade. I was there as part of their safety contingent. It was incredible. Two-Spirit people came into the space, were conducting ceremonies. It was actually incredible. It recovered the spirit of Stonewall and more. And of course, there's now anti-trans organizing and resistance to it. This is actually a protest against Megan Murphy when she appeared at the Toronto Public Library, and there were about 1,000 people there. It was using the same chances slogans as Black Lives Matter had, adapting them to trans experiences. I'm not going to be able to deal with the pandemic, but maybe someone can ask a question about that. I think one of the major problems is we forgot about what we learned in organizing around the AIDS crisis and from AIDS activism. And the lessons that people could have learned from us in terms of dealing with the pandemic, we did not focus on, we did not develop. And then, of course, there's the global uprising against the police and anti-Black racism and no pride in genocide in 2021. Now, they want us now to forget about that. They want to return to a normal LGBT plus politics that forgets about everything that we learned from those struggles. And of course, we now need different approaches. So abolitionist politics in particular, this is a scene from abolitionist and anti-fascist pride from last year in Toronto. And just maybe one example I'll just mention here. If you use a limited rights approach to talk about trans people being imprisoned, what it leads to is thinking the only important thing is, are they going to be placed into an institution that is the right one in terms of their gender identification and experiences? But from an abolitionist approach, it's a very different question that is raised, which is, why are trans people being arrested at all? Why are they being imprisoned? Why are we accepting prisons as a social form for this? And sort of coming to the end, I don't know if people can identify this image. It's actually the Battle of Billings Bridge, what's mythologically now described that way, in Ottawa, after the Freedom Convoy, so-called Freedom Convoy, had been in existence for a while. The Punch Up Anarchist Collective and a dog walking group actually came across Freedom Convoy people trying to reinforce the Freedom Convoy. And they started to call people, and by the end of the day, more than 1,000 people were there, and they entirely blocked what the Freedom Convoy people were trying to do. Interestingly enough, because these plans were to be extended the next week, that is the week that the Emergency Act is declared by the federal government. So what we need is both radical hope and revolutionary love. And part of that could be tied together by looking at how people are now chanting slogans like, who keeps us safe? We keep us safe. And that comes out of the protests we organized in terms of targeting the right-wing anti-trans organizations, but it's also being chanted by thousands of people at Palestine solidarity demonstrations. So I think I've probably gone on a little bit more. I was going to read some sections from the book, but I won't do that right now. Obviously, I want to thank lots of people. The people who are not on this list include the ASL translators, the people, there's someone doing captioning here. This is just really indispensable work. And there's all sorts of other people who could be thanked as well. I did want to leave with one Vancouver reference, even though it's in Ottawa. This is another picture from the 1975 National Gay Lesbian Conference, National Gay Rights Coalition Conference. And that is a person who becomes a major AIDS activist and ACT UP activist in Vancouver, John Kozachenko, there at the end of the sort of Congo line or whatever they're doing in terms of dancing. And I just wanted to once again express to people that while we're actually fighting the state and having very serious struggles against state and heterosexist and patriarchal and transphobic relations, we also know as queer and trans people that we have a hell of a lot of fun while we're doing it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Gary, for that talk. I'm going to introduce AJ now. So AJ Withers is the Ruth Wynn Woodward Jr. Chair in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Simon Fraser University. I was personally so thrilled when they came out here to Vancouver to take up that position and become a dear colleague. They are a trans, non-binary, disabled settler currently living here in what the Squamish call Kemkemalai, and they are a longtime community organizer and author of many books, Disability, Politics, and Theory, which we're celebrating the revised and expanded edition of that book tonight, but also Fight to Win, Inside Poor People's Organizing, and AJ is also the co-author of A Violent History of Benevolence. So we're actually this evening celebrating two of AJ's projects, the book that I just mentioned, but also the Unicorn Eradication Project, A Story About Eugenics, which is a kids movie AJ has made about eugenics. And so we're gonna screen the film first, and then we're gonna turn over to AJ to talk more about their work and relationships between the film and the new edition of the book. So the film's about 7 minutes long. It's a digital stop motion fabric collage, and it's written and illustrated by AJ. As you'll see from the film and AJ's presentation, and really all of AJ's work in general, their work is committed to thinking across disability, poverty, dispossession, racialization, and carcerality, and gender and sexuality. And we're gonna see lots of those connections and their resonances with Gary's work in the Q&A. So with that, I will turn it over to our tech folks for the film, and then AJ will come up afterwards.
It's a world premiere, too.
It's the world premiere.
The Unicorn Eradication Project, a story about eugenics. A long time ago, there were lots of different kinds of horses with many diverse colors. There were also unicorns, pegasi, and pegacorns in the horse family. All of the different kinds of horses played together on the land. They shared what they had and took care of each other. One day, some of the horses decided they wanted more food, more land, and less work. These horses attacked some other horses and took their land. Many horses were forced to flee. Then, it didn't rain for a long time, and the horses, unicorns, and pegasi got very thirsty. The horses would not let any of the other horses drink from the river. They all used to share the river, but now only some horses were allowed to drink from it. They built factories to make the horses work for the things that they all used to share. All the horses who had to leave their homes were forced to do difficult, painstaking work in the factories. The days were long in the factory. Work was especially hard for the unicorns, pegasi, and pegacorns because the factories were not designed with them in mind. The machines were constantly breaking because the pegasi's feathers kept getting stuck in them. Unicorns were always accidentally poking holes in the things that were made in the factories. This was an especially big problem in the little cake factory. One day, the bosses fired all of the pegacorns, pegasi, and unicorns. They said unicorns and pegasi were deformed and defective. Without any land or money, some of the fired workers asked other horses for money. Some stole grain to have enough food to survive. Some of them started circuses and traveled around doing tricks. Other horses would gawk and laugh. The horses who had fired all the pegasi and unicorns said that stealing and begging and doing tricks for money were proof that they weren't true horses. They said that they would make sure that there was no more unicorns or pegasi or pegacorns. They set up places that these beautiful special horses were forced to go and could never leave. Breeding programs started to get rid of all the unicorns and pegasi and make all the horses the same. They called the programs eugenics. After a while, all the unicorns and pegasi were gone. And many of the horses were rich, but they weren't happy. They had succeeded in making sure that no one shared any more, and that all the special horses were gone. But all the horses that had gone had been part of their families and their communities. Without the unicorns, pegasi, and pegacorns, the horses had lost their magic. The horses had forgot about the unicorns, the pegasi, and the pegacorns. And many years passed. Then, one day, a very special pony was born. Eugenics is a set of practices and ideas based in the belief that some people are born better than other people, and the people that are considered not as good should be gotten rid of. Jewish people, people of color, disabled people, gay, lesbian, queer, and trans people, non-Christians, and poor people are the groups of people that are usually not considered good under eugenics. The idea of eugenics became popular over 100 years ago and has been used all around the world. In Germany, in the 1930s, the government brought in an official eugenics program. Hundreds of thousands of people were forced to have operations so they could not have babies. Later, millions of people were put into camps, called concentration camps, to separate the people who were considered bad from the rest of the people. About 12 million people were killed in the name of eugenics. It ended when the Second World War ended in 1945. This mass murder was named the Holocaust. In Canada and the United States, some provinces and states worked hard to try to keep the people that they thought weren't very good away from the people who they thought were good. 2 provinces and many states passed laws forcing hundreds of thousands of people to have operations so they couldn't have babies. Some of these laws were still being used in the 1970s. Can you imagine what the world would look like if everyone was the same? It would probably be pretty boring. Like the horses without the unicorns and pegasi. Lots of people who are considered not good, like the unicorns and pegasi and pegacorns in the story, are separated from society by prisons and institutions and borders, or are pressured not to have kids. These are the ways eugenics still work today. But each of us can work to celebrate our differences and to support one another when people with power try to keep people apart, lock people up, keep people down, or not let people be themselves. We can all work together to fight against eugenics and things like it, and make the world a better place for all of us.
The unicorns and the pegasi and pegacorns obviously evoke queerness, disability, and racialization, and that story is also one, obviously, of colonialism and capitalism. Anti-eugenic discourse is used by anti-trans actors to say that hormones and surgeries render youth and young adults sterile, so that gender-affirming care should be banned. So here we have eugenics being used against trans people in both directions. But I want to caution people from creating a narrative of innocence, because queer and trans people disproportionately practice eugenics today. Human reproduction requires an egg and a sperm, and queer and trans family units often don't have both of these, and so have to seek out one or the other, or both, and in that seeking, oftentimes end up engaging in eugenic practices. And of course, these are differentiated along cultural, racial, class, and border lines. So I'm not saying that prospective 2S LGBTQIA+ parents are eugenicists, and many of them are adamantly opposed to eugenics. But I am, and I'm certainly not saying that there's anything wrong or bad about the children that are produced through these processes. But I am saying that individuals in these circumstances are caught up in a set of social relations that are deeply implicated in and penetrated by eugenics, and the consequence is a resultant in eugenic practices. And so those of us who are queer or trans, at least some of us of a certain age, have likely heard our friends have some of these conversations, or might have even had them ourselves. So-and-so is taller. Yes, but so-and-so might be a little shorter, but is so much smarter. So-and-so's out because their parent, sister, grandparent, third cousin is autistic, has Huntington's, is fat, has muscular dystrophy, has fill in the blank. And so these might not feel eugenic, but they're really about getting who you consider to be more fit to reproduce, and that's the core component of positive eugenics. And so I call this informal eugenics. Semi-formal eugenics is when a third party mediates obtaining a sperm and egg, so this is typically a fertility clinic, and oftentimes consumers are unaware that eugenics is taking place at all. Sometimes this is called liberal eugenics because it's focused on choice. Prospective queer and trans parents just say, I just want my kid to have the best possible future. I'm just looking out for my kid. And it just happens to be that thin, tall, and attractive people are treated better. Non-disabled people are treated better. Light-skinned people are treated better. Straight, cis people are treated better. So who decides what the criteria are? What are the criteria? And why are people trying to make genetic interventions into social injustices in the first place? And anti-gay eugenicists can breathe a little bit easier because it's illegal for men who have sex with men to be anonymous sperm donors. This week, Canada changed it for men who have sex with men, MSM, from that to just anal sex. But it obviously still targets MSM, and it's banned for all gay men to be anonymous sperm donors from the United States, and that's where almost all sperm donation comes from in Canada anyways. And I'm not trying to say that it's heritable to that gayness is heritable, but that this still is a eugenic policy, even though it's imposed for a different scientifically invalid reason. And choice moves away from disability, not towards it. So when a deaf lesbian couple wanted to select for a deaf child so that their child would be born deaf, there was mass outrage against them. So this is from Zytex Canada, a fertility clinic's website. And we have some soft blues and grays and a few stock icons. And eugenics is easily read into it, creating healthy families, wide array of donors from esteemed universities, and there's a few things going on here. So studies show that education is used as a stand-in for intelligence when it isn't. And intelligence isn't heritable the way that people imagine it to be, and esteemed implies a class status. There are photos available and a comprehensive donor screening process, and then of course a happy white baby with blonde hair and blue eyes is featured. Sperm banks operate within white supremacist social relations, and they work to uphold those social relations. And then lastly, formal eugenic practices, what I call formal eugenic practices, are those coordinated and controlled by the state. Eggs and sperm that are being sold must be screened for a suite of conditions, and this is a specific attempt to keep certain kinds of people from ever being born. So I wanted to start with this section of the book because of the complexity and because of the complicity of queer and trans people in relation to eugenics. And while some queer and trans people really benefit from this, they get respectability, normativity, others really get left behind. And we're seeing the extreme end result of respectability politics right now as some people are trying to sever the Q and the T from the LGB, and as we see the emergence of groups like Gays Against Groomers. But this has happened before. In pursuit of respectability, the homophile movement, as it was called then, fought to remove homosexuality from the list of psychiatric illnesses. And this is a photo from a protest against the American Psychiatric Association. It's a large and mostly sit-in, and the only legible placard is a giant one that says, "Homo is healthy." And they not only left trans folks behind, which is the often heard critique, but they also legitimized the entire system of pathologizing madness, of pathologizing non-normativity, of crisis, and of diversity. And the queers aren't the only ones who've done this. Lots of groups have worked to gain privilege from reasserting the oppression of or distancing themselves from disabled people. And indeed, it's been sort of the modus operandi of the trans movement for decades. Deaf people have argued that they are a linguistic and cultural minority, and so not disabled. Psych survivors have argued that they're not disabled, and both groups do so, saying that there's nothing wrong with them. It's true. There's nothing wrong with them. But in the way that they do it, they work to reinforce the idea that there's something fundamentally wrong with the disabled people that they're working to separate themselves from. Disability is a social relation and a tactic. Disability is socially produced through the relations between people, and it's an identity that's tactically imposed on people in the interests of the powerful. So that's why disability isn't a fixed category, and it's changed as social relations have changed and as have major economic, social, or political shifts have happened. Disability and or including madness are temporally, so time, and culturally contingent. So this means, for example, that we're on land that the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh have been the caretakers of since time immemorial. And on this land, the dominant definition of disability or conception of disability is profoundly different than today than it was a couple hundred years ago, which isn't to say that there wasn't cultural variation in, or isn't, within those nations. And indeed, the exact conceptualization of disability itself, the way that in the Euro-American sense, is a part of the cultural genocide project. It's part of the erasure of indigenous knowledges and what Gary Kinsman and Patricia Gentile call the social organization of forgetting, this imposition of a very particular kind of social relation, conceptualization of disability on top of and instead of other cultural understandings of difference. So, but AJ, you have chronic pain, you're neurodiverse, you have a real long list of things, and that's what makes you disabled. Wrong. There's two things that make me disabled. So the first is that I identify with other disabled people. I feel a political kinship with other disabled people, and this is what Mia Mingus calls politically disabled. And relatedly but independently to that, my capacity to fully participate in the capitalist labor market is limited, and or I am identified by ruling relations as disabled. One or the other of identifying as or being identified as would make anyone disabled. So, but AJ, Gaza. People are being killed and made disabled. Disability is a very real in terms of the physical reality and the profound, maddening trauma that is, the profound, maddening trauma that people are experiencing. So let's be really clear. What we're witnessing in Gaza is an ongoing genocide. And a few years ago, Jasper Poir wrote a book called The Right to Maim. And she talks about not only how the state has the right to kill, but using Palestine as an example, how the state has the right to not let die, the right to maim. And she calls this maiming debility, or this being maimed. And I call this process disablement. And Israel's strategy in Gaza has obviously moved from one of mass disablement to mass murder, with disablement coinciding. But we can distinguish harm and disablement from disabled people. War and poverty cause harm. They are choices. They're social policy choices. And they lead to the identification of disability, often en masse. So the problem here is the harm. It's the choice that people in power are making to cause mass disablement, and it isn't the people themselves. In the first edition and this revised and expanded edition of Disability Politics and Theory, there were really collective processes, and many people read many drafts and gave lots of feedback, and also all of those long kitchen table and coffee shop discussions about politics all helped lead to this. And in particular, my partner Laura here, who's also very generously working the book table, gave invaluable feedback and really brilliant insights, so thank you, Laura. There was also really substantial intellectual contribution made by my longtime friend Laurie Erickson, whose picture is there, fully 100% accurate. And she worked on conceptually developing what I call the radical model together with me. In this edition, in the final chapter, I outlined 7 pillars of a radical framework, and it works to build on the principles of the radical model that I put forward on my website in 2008 and later published in 2012 in the first edition. And it brings it into conversation with the 10 Principles of Disability Justice, which has several incarnations, but was first published by Patty Byrne in 2015, and later subsequent iterations have a number of different authors, but including Sins Invalid. And in the notes, I provide very detailed accounts of what I'm drawing on from where and who and when. And so the first point of these 7 is that disability is a social relation and a tactic. And so when I say a social relation, I mean that disability, like oppression, like capitalism, like colonialism, is the interactions of people. It's not a thing. These aren't systems, structures, or biological realities. They have very real material consequences, though, like poverty. And I really want to thank Gary for pushing me in this direction and introducing me to the Dorothy Smith School of Thought in terms of social relations. And also thank you, Gary, for coming all this way and for that amazing talk. But what I'm putting forward is an anti-essentialist framework. Disability isn't an innate or essential characteristic of someone. And this is my central theoretical departure with Byrne and Sins Invalid and what they call the 10 Principles of Disability Justice. They argue that, quote, a disability justice orientation names ableism as a constructed violent ordering of bodily difference, end quote. So this definition of ableism naturalizes disability as being in the body, as being about bodily differences between people. But all bodies are different. Ableism, or what I call disableism, is about the relations between people. It is about power. And it's not the case, as the Principles of Disability Justice state, quote, the nature of our disabled body minds means that we resist conforming to normative levels of productivity in a capitalist culture, end quote. Because there's no natural disabled body mind, disability is a social category, it's a social relation. So the second of these 7 things is in and through. And this comes from Himani Banerjee, also via Gary. And it means understanding that disability is produced in and through other social relations. And that also disabled people are members of all oppressed groups. So when trans folks say, we're not disabled because there's nothing wrong with that, there's something especially problematic about that because they're erasing the existence of otherwise disabled trans folks. So they're erasing the existence of a lot of folks that I see here today, including me. And, oh, sorry, I lost my spot. Okay. And disableism, white supremacy, colonialism, capitalism, cis-heteropatriarchy are all co-constituted. And they can't be severed, nor can they be undone or even understood independently. Number 3 is liberation for all. So in and through necessitates both working for the liberation for all, not to gain privilege for some disabled people, like the mainstream disability rights movement does, and taking leadership from the people that are most directly impacted, which is easy to say and often quite messy and hard to do. Number 4 is rooted in what Chris Dixon calls the 4 antis. Disableism can only be eliminated by anchoring disability struggles in anti-capitalism, anti-oppression, anti-authoritarianism, and anti-imperialism, and within anti-imperialism is anti-colonialism, and I add decolonization. And this also includes working from a bottom-up justice perspective. The 5th is interdependence, and we all rely on others to survive and to thrive. So who here grew all the food that you ate today? No one? Who here is wearing all the clothes that you've sewn yourselves? No? Well, buttonholes are quite difficult. Disabled people are constructed as needy because the interdependence of non-disabled people is normalized and rendered invisible. So disabled people are constructed as being excessive. One of the primary reasons that we have been and continue to be categorized as disabled is because we are considered to be unproductive or underproductive within the capitalist relations. In practice, capitalism is upheld by a number of myths. One of those myths is that white people are superior to indigenous people, black people, and people of color. And another is that men are superior to women, that there are only men and women, and that those identities are fixed. And capitalism isn't necessarily cis-heteropatriarchal and racist, but the current form of global capitalism that we have certainly is. And all forms of capitalism are oppressive. They all work to benefit the few at the expense of the many. And so Marta Russell says that disabled people are the cautionary tale for capitalism, the moral hazard to keep workers in line. Quit working, end up poor, end up excluded from space and from society. So number 6 is whole selves, hard parts. Disabled people are multifaceted. We become who we are through our experiences of disability, and we are much more than that. As well, we have to create space to talk about the hard parts of our experiences of our body minds, but also hard parts of our experiences of our body minds is not specific to disabled people. That is a very common experience. And then the last one is radical and collective access. Accessibility must be envisioned broadly, including the multiple barriers that keep disabled people out of spaces, and it must be addressed collectively. So we did some basic stuff here tonight to make this space accessible. But until transit is free, until childcare, elder care, and attendant care are free and appropriate and available, until people have their basic needs met, until people in this space have their gender identities respected, and this space is no longer occupied by a colonial force, it's not accessible. I first wrote Disability Politics and Theory, which I started in 2001, because we were invisible. Disabled people were cut out of social justice movements, which largely saw us as exceptional. Our social exclusion made sense to people, and the mainstream disability rights movement was liberal, as was disability studies. And there was one book, Eli Clare's Exile and Pride, that I saw myself in. So we tell folks to do the work, to educate themselves about oppression, but at the time, that was a really hollow thing to say, because there was nowhere that people could look. So that's why I wrote Disability Politics and Theory. And over a decade after I started, and 2 decades after it came out, no, the other way around, things have changed beyond my imagining. A new generation of scholars is committed to addressing colonialism and white supremacy in disability studies, at least some of them are, and disability discourse and disabled people have become so much more involved in social justice movements. People get it now, at least some of the time. The book opens with my telling of an anecdote of my surprise of coming to Vancouver and hearing the Stand Up, Fight Back chant after having worked for years in Toronto to replace it with Unite, Fight Back decades ago. And Gary pointed out to me, though, the other day that Stand Up, Fight Back used to be Act Up, Fight Back. So the emergence of Stand Up wasn't just disableist, it was actually distancing from both radical tactics and from queerness, the social organization of forgetting. Nevertheless, so much has changed. And while positive, what does it really matter? Because the material realities of the disabled people at the bottom are much, much worse than they were 10 and 20 years ago. Further, a large portion of the population said that it was okay for thousands of disabled people to die so that they weren't inconvenienced by masks and mandates. And yet, the left did very little. So let's not celebrate the fact that we have vans at our demos and that we have ASL interpreters at some of our events when we can afford them, because there's a very real tension there. Drug users and trans folks are really at the front lines right now. Forced drug treatment for drug users and the denial of gender-affirming care for trans youth is the same attack. Yet there's often hatred between these groups, even though trans youth are often drug users. And the attack is anti-authoritarianism. Pardon me, it would be awesome if it was. The attack is authoritarianism. And it's done under the guise of freedom, the freedom movement. And this is the same freedom movement that supported mass COVID death. So we're all under attack by this same movement. So we need to stop talking to ourselves and build bridges to work to build real resistance within and way beyond the communities that we personally identify with. We need to build a sustained fight back, and we need to fight to win. Thanks.
assuming someone just turned these on for us. Yeah? Good, okay, great. Thank you both. That was excellent. And to hear like such radical connections between the two talks, I think is going to be so generative for our question and answer period. So we have about half an hour, up to half an hour for that. And if you have a question, you can raise your hand, and I'm going to bring a microphone over to you. So I see, oh, somebody is going to bring a microphone to you. So I see somebody over here in the gray hoodie.
Hi, my name is Heidi, and I'd just like to thank Gary and thank AJ. And Gary had a health scare this year. I think scared the shit out of a lot of people, like his partner and kids, and major health. But look at him, he's still going. He's still an activist. Let's give him a hand. You know, it's really tough going. AJ, I have some comments. I don't necessarily disagree, but perhaps you just didn't mention them. But I personally wanted fleshed out is the fact that the word disability is a state-constructed word. To me, disability is about poverty, and the state has taken that. Well, not totally, right, made up, but I mean, they've taken this concept and legislated poverty. They've made you poor. If I had enough money to adjust a workplace and had more money, I'd probably be better. Certainly, you know, my life would go better, but we're still expecting that our family, if we have one, or partners, or whoever takes care of us. It's obscene. And as a disabled person for years, I've been involved in movements and just watch how they barely bring up the whole issue. For example, I think that guaranteed income is a great idea because people take part in every way, economically and socially, in society, and you don't have to worry about, you know, how much you're earning or your worth. And the other thing is about, I don't want to call it a right, but people want to form families, whether they're, you know, 3 of them they met 20 years ago and they're together, or they want children in that, and trans people, gay people, queer people face the same dilemmas that other group of people face who want to have children, and within laws that aren't created for, you know, non-traditional families. So they're stuck in that. Again, the state is creating what our families should be. And for Gary, what do we do, Gary? You guys didn't mention SOGI. Well, I feel the importance of SOGI. It's a big thing here in BC, as in other places. So what do we do? What do I do with my time on all my big fat disability check besides drink Pernod or whatever?
Yeah, so we had so 2 questions. First for AJ. One is about the word disability, and the second question is about families and the desire to have family.
Yeah, so thank you for those questions. We could talk for a real long time. So I'm gonna try and be brief. Like the word disability, the way that we think of it now, sort of amalgamates through European social assistance and the term invalid, which actually meant getting access. You're invalid to work, so you get access to a benefit that other people didn't get. And so it didn't always mean that, but it was, I would agree, like always tied to the state conceptualization of and fitness to work. Although, like, you know, it's very murky and it shifts and there's like large groups of people that get caught up in it. But yeah, it is a sentence to poverty for most people. And it certainly was for me for a really long time until I discovered you could get paid if you go to grad school. It's gross. But there can be a lot of things that happen at the same time, and people, lots of people have worked to reclaim it, to build pride around it. Like, I think one of the key things that I'm trying to say is that it is a social construction. It's not about like there's this group of people that somehow innately have a trait that makes them less than, and therefore their oppression is justified. It really is about the state ruling relations defining this group of people because of their like relationship to the market and to other social relations. And so it's really important to think about it that way, because the left has often just accepted the oppression of disabled people because it's like, oh yeah, they're different. They're somehow different, which it's done with other groups, right? And I think, but with respect to basic income, I must disagree. I think that basic income sounds great, but without universal housing, it's a subsidy to slumlords. And it just means that you're gonna raise and raise rents as basic income goes up, but it also fundamentally disadvantages disabled folks, because with basic income, like unlike a lot of social assistance, which comes with disability-specific benefits, basic income is a flat rate. So the people who need specific benefits, who are disabled folks, don't get those. So non-disabled folks come out further ahead than disabled folks. So I think, like, once we all have housing, everyone getting... Okay, great. Let's get housing first, and then we can talk about... Yeah. So we need to decommodify housing. And once we do that, let's talk about like beer and deodorant money for everyone. I'm down. But like, we need food, we need housing, and without those things, like if we have private grocers, Loblaws is also gonna just raise food prices as long as people have a check, right? So as capitalism and basic income, they don't really work together.
Well, that's the whole point here. We're having a revolution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then with respect to families, of course. And I think, I'm not saying that queer and trans folks shouldn't have families. I'm not even saying that they shouldn't engage with fertility clinics. But I really want people to be aware of what they're doing and the relationships, the relations that they're involving themselves in, and to stop having those conversations in front of me, and and really to just think about like alternative things and think critically about like why it is that people feel the need to biologically reproduce themselves, and if that's a thing they need to do. But like folks with criminal records who are disproportionately BIPOC folks don't have access to adoption, right? So it's not like it would be gross to be like, well, just adopt. Like that's not an option for lots of people. So I'm not trying to say don't do it or do it this way and only use your friends and don't have those kinds of conversations, and then your friend becomes a weirdo and tries to take away your kid in 10 years. Like it's all very complicated. But I think it's really important that people start having conversations about how deeply complicated it is and how deeply implicated we all are in really harmful relations around eugenics.
Yeah, Gary, the question for you was, what do we do? And with some specific
what is to be
reference
done?
to SOGI in the context here in BC.
So first of all, thanks, Heidi. And I also want to point out that Heidi was really quite instrumental in getting going the work on critical approaches to national security that led to both the WHO's national security book and the Canadian War on Queers. So I want to first of all just thank Heidi for all of the incredible work that you've done and support you've provided for lots of people, including myself. So what is to be done? I'm going to try and be really brief. It actually goes back to Mariam Keba and the notion of hope as discipline. And I'll just give two examples. One of the reasons that I get motivated as an activist and to some extent an organizer, although I think I'm less of an organizer than I used to be, is that I remember in my body the struggles that we've waged that have actually led to significant victories in people's lives. So for instance, in AIDS Action Now, when we did our direct actions, we actually led to people getting treatments that allowed them to live longer and to have better lives. And that, for me, really motivates me to want to do things. When I was involved in the Sudbury Coalition Against Poverty, we'd be told if we contacted the social Ontario Works, let's say, that there's no way that this woman that you're advocating for is going to get her check today. And we'd say, okay, if that's what you think, you'll see us soon. We would send 10 people down to the office, completely disrupt their ability to do work, and by the end of the day, that woman always had that check. So what I'm saying is if we actually engage, not in respectable, polite politics that they're always trying to tell us to do, like write a letter, have a petition, but if we actually engage in direct action politics, which involves our bodies in defying laws and injustice, I think that's one of the things I would really want to suggest that we need to do. So that's sort of my quick response to what is to be done. Obviously, it's a much, much bigger question than that, but I'm also interested in what other people are interested in talking about and other questions. So thanks, Heidi.
Are there other questions?
AJ, you were talking about, you had that blue-eyed, blonde-haired kid. How do we deal with, and I guess for either of you, how do we deal with this language that's been so sanitized and so, like the language of fascism is very sanitized in many cases. How do we deal with that subtle thing that, I want to say centrists don't pick up on, I think they do, but how do we deal with that? The kind of passivity, the redefinition of conversion therapy.
Yeah, that's a good question, and my main activity in my life is watching anti-SOGI, anti-trans, and white supremacist videos on double speed, and it's terrible. And so I see that a lot, and one of the things so often is this response to I have no hate in my heart, and a redefinition of so many words and videos about how to respond to people saying that we're fascists, how to respond to people saying these things. And so I've really been thinking about that and also the dog whistling. So I think a couple things are thinking about how we frame our language. So in just removing any kind of moralism from things. So not talking about hate, because I think we can't let racists define racism, but also we can very clearly be here's the criteria of anti-trans, and you are it. Instead of being you hate trans people, just being you're anti-trans. And there's a really great mapping conversion therapy map that has very clear definitions of what conversion therapy is and what anti-trans means that I find really helpful. And yeah, just being like, we define these terms and we will make it clear how we're using them, but that's really only very effective if we're removing kind of moralism from the picture. And I want to just thank Travis for sending me that map.
Gary, did you want to respond to that
maybe
too?
I'll try and say something really quick, because I think in some ways we also have to recognize the ways in which the mainstream LGBT plus movement, and unfortunately I think in some ways SOGI sort of overlaps with that, although really interestingly, if you actually were on the SOGI list as I was, it's now disappeared. I don't know why I'm not on it, maybe because I raised too many critical things around Palestine. What you actually saw was groups in the North and the West being lambasted by people involved in groups in the global South for not being willing to take a position on the genocide in Palestine. So that's just one interesting thing. But I wanted to point out that we actually need to recognize how often our movements themselves produce some significant problems. So for instance, it was not simply state agencies and government officials or even social democrats who decided that trans people, gender identity, gender associations should not be included in human rights legislation in the 70s and 80s. That was decided by lesbian and gay activists themselves who thought trying to deal with trans stuff and gender stuff would not be worthwhile for us and would actually mean real problems for us. So what that meant is that formal human rights for trans people were delayed for decades because the mainstream of the LGB movement at that time, which really was what it was, actually made those types of decisions. So we need to actually recognize that we no longer want to accept that type of politics. And that also affects people who've declared that the blood ban is over when it isn't, right? And there apparently was an announcement today, I'm not quite sure what took place there, but the blood bans still exist, and we need to challenge them and not accept the hoopla for the Liberal government and the Canadian Blood Services, which is engaged in direct anti-Black, racist, homophobic stuff against Omi Sheree Dryden, who's written the foreword for the 3rd edition of the book. I mean, unless these things are actually addressed, there's no apology should be accepted from Canadian Blood Services and the Canadian government. The last thing is just around conversion therapy, and this is another dimension to what you're talking about, is that conversion therapy still exists in practice on the ground, because the government sort of declaring it over doesn't mean it's over. And the other thing, and again, I'm going to perhaps have a problem with language here, but the conversion therapy as it was developed also was conversion therapy directed against autistic people. And if we do not actually take that up as part of our challenge to conversion therapy, we're actually saying that queer and trans autistic people can just, let's just leave them to conversion therapy. Anyway, it's more detailed than that, and I try to take it up in the 3rd edition of the book, but I think we actually need to be really critical of the victories that are claimed that actually aren't victories at all, but actually perpetuate the oppression of particular groups of people within our communities and networks. Thanks, and I'm looking forward to other questions and comments.
Can I just give one more example about that? So with SOGI stuff, there's like this long-standing understanding that schools aren't safe for queer and trans kids, right? But now with SOGI, the new narrative is these new anti-trans rules are making schools not safe for trans and non-binary kids. And it's like, what? They weren't safe. And if you're telling this particular story, you're really telling a story for a very specific group of kids. And if you start from schools are carceral and they're not safe for a lot of kids, then we can look at radical solutions. But if we start from this liberal position of schools are safe and these one little things are making them not safe, we're only benefiting very, very few middle-class white kids. And we're working to reinforce the harm that schools are creating for so many kids already.
Okay, we have time for sure for one more question. I see two, so I'm going to gather both your questions. So person in the black shirt and then person in the, is that a floral? It's lovely, floral pattern shirt. Yeah.
Hi, yeah, I just think one of the most distressing things to me recently is the CAST report coming out of the UK, especially because we have, so much political ties with their culture, and I'm very concerned how it's going to affect Canada. And yeah, it's one of those things that does, like we were just talking about, how that sort of the veneer of niceness and science, playing with science and data, and I'm just looking at the data. So I'd be curious for your reactions to that, I guess is my question.
Congrats on the film. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about your motivation and your intended audience and where it's going, where you see it going, what's planned for it.
The film is now on YouTube, and that hopefully children watch it with parental supervision. Yeah, I made it because I was researching eugenics for many days in microfiche and came home and said, why can't I just research unicorns and bunnies? And then woke up with that and then couldn't sleep for days until it was finished, until the book version of it was finished. Couldn't find a publisher for the book. And then it took 8 years to make a film that's 7 minutes long. Because I don't actually know how to make films. Yeah, so that was the motivation, and just trying to make it accessible and not devastating. And that trying to figure out that balance is hard, and it's like kind of weirdly liberal at times, but also it's for kids, so that's a hard thing to find and be okay with. And then for the CAST report, for folks that don't know, it's this like really massive anti-trans report that came out in the UK, and it like rejects so much good scientific evidence because it has findings that find reasonable things about gender affirming care, and just accepts ridiculous evidence, including like this YouTuber said this thing, because they're anti-trans people. And so it's just awful, and this is going to keep coming. And so and media doesn't have the literacy to be able to understand the difference between legitimate sources. And so we have to do that for them, and it's hard when it's 400 pages. Trash Future did an episode on it, and I really recommend that folks listen to that. And just in general, it's the best podcast ever if you're interested in obscure British politics, or not, in just the world. But that was really helpful for me in understanding the CAST report and its significance and its weaknesses. But yeah, I don't have much to say about it except for it's bullshit and it's scary, and we're going to see more of it, and we have to figure out ways to deal with it. And also potentially, like, one of the things that I do in my work is I figured out that through Freedom of Information Act requests, we can get their data, the government's data, and then use it against them because they respect quantitative data so much. And so potentially that's something that we can try and figure out too, is how do we produce data that is respectable in a way that will be useful.
Yeah, I'm not that familiar with the CAST report. There's one thing I wanted to add in, though, because I'm finding it increasingly sort of a little bit frustrating that people are constructing the right-wing and Christian fascist and other fascist attacks on trans people as being motivated by trans people being a really vulnerable group. I'm not trying to suggest that trans people aren't a vulnerable group, But I think what's not being recognized is that trans people, genderqueer people, people challenging the gender binary, have actually undermined in very material and social ways the right wing and its views of the world, right? I mean, it's really challenging things. So rather than us saying trans people are being attacked because the right wing really wants to go after other issues, but trans people are really vulnerable, let's actually recognize what's really going on, which is that the trans revolution, if you want to call it that, and all that's around it, and it's a lot more than that, is actually putting the gender binary and gender relations in question, and that's really what we're addressing. So this is actually a fundamental challenge to the way in which this social world is organized. And actually, part of what we actually need to be raising is more radical, more transformative perspectives around trans issues. So for instance, the last thing I'll mention is the proposal for a Rainbow Week of Action in support of trans people, which I think is supposed to start on May 17th through a group called Queer Momentum, actually came from a group in St. John's who proposed this to Queer Momentum and other groups. Then Queer Momentum took that idea and has got mainstream LGBT plus groups organizing these actions, and actually then told the group in St. John's that they had to organize an action on a particular day. So it completely appropriated the issue from the grassroots community-based group. And I think we have to begin to realize that if they're really thinking that calling on the Canadian state to actually address anti-trans as the fundamental solution we're going to have, simply means there's going to be more police and potentially new sections of the criminal code that will also be used against us. And that instead, we actually need to understand what's really been successful. Like at the Fort York Public Library in Toronto, at the high school I used to go to, which Save Canada prioritized as one of their targets. It's a Christian fascist organization. It was actually direct action by Students for Queer Liberation, by anti-fascist queer and trans and other activists that actually protected people and stopped the right wing from being able to get anywhere near Victoria Park Secondary School where I went. So I think we need to learn from what's actually going on the ground, rather than accepting that somehow the federal Liberal government, if it doesn't get defeated in the next election, is going to somehow protect us, because it's not. Anyway, I'll leave it there. And I mean, that's why I think slogans like, who keeps us safe, we keep us safe, when it's understood by thousands of people and we actually make it real, that's really our solution. Thanks.
Okay, that brings us to the end of our time together this evening. A couple things to note is just a reminder that there are books for sale in the back corner. They are discounted, and also 25% of sales from tonight will go to Palestinian solidarity organizing. I want to thank all of you for being here tonight and being so generous with your questions and your attention. And most importantly, I want us to give a big round of thanks to Gary and AJ for sharing their work and their knowledge with us this evening.
And thank you, Kate.
Yes, thank you.